Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Frank Sesno, Director of the School of Media and Public Affairs, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for the official and very exciting launch of the project on ethics in political communication. We live in challenging times, very challenging times, and so this is a challenge that we eagerly embrace. The project on ethics in political communication will promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. So I'd like to welcome our audience here in the room, and I'd like to welcome our live stream and video audience joining us here today for what I think will be a very provocative, important, and interesting conversation. Many thanks to the Democracy Fund for sponsoring this lunch and providing some initial support for the project. MBA programs emerged in the early 20th century as the world of business got more complex, and there was an appreciation that we needed to do a deeper dive. And by the 1960s, courses in business ethics were widespread. So the question is, in response to an increasingly complex political world, what is the response? In 1982, the George Washington University offered the first undergraduate degree in political communication. And increasing numbers of undergraduate students and graduate students now study political communication or take courses in political communication on the way to their degrees. Here we offer a degree, an undergraduate degree in political communication. So it's time, we think, for those who teach and research and care about political communication to follow those who teach and research and care about business, journalism, and law and medicine to help deepen the study and deepen the appreciation of the core parts of what we do. Now, along the way, we hope we can improve the ethics of working political communication professionals, the speechwriters, ad makers, digital strategists, and the rest of the professionals who work to advance ideas and candidates and positions and their advocacy. And I think we're uniquely qualified to do this because of who we are and where we are right here in Washington, D.C., and because of the appetite for this. And I think you all had a good appetite at lunch, so you've all dined on this to start with. We are, as a result, launching the project on ethics in political communication. The project's starting small: a website, social media, your lunch and other low-key events, a course here at SMPA, a volume edited by one of our faculty due out next year. So if there is interest and if we see traction, and I expect that we will respond to that, we will grow with it, and we will try to increase our impact and influence, because we all know the country, our democracy, very much needs this. I'm happy to say that the project is being led by Peter Loge. He's an associate professor, a political practitioner. He's in residence with SMPA and is an esteemed colleague and a great friend. So Peter, hats off to you for all you've done on this, your thought leadership in getting us here, your hard work in organizing the conversations to define the parameters of this project, and the execution. You should know a fun little thing about Peter. It sort of says more or less what you need to know, that in his office there is a Plato finger puppet in front of a letter from President Barack Obama thanking him for his service at the FDA. Now, if you can figure out the connections there, I would welcome you to do that, but I think it's all good. The other thing you should know about Peter is he's an avid fan of soccer and has written the quintessential book about management using soccer as the metaphor and the roadmap. And actually, that really helps, because there are goals, aren't there? And there are inbounds and out of bounds, and Peter's great wisdom is a guiding light for us. His team consists of two of our esteemed and most accomplished undergraduates. Gabrielle Serena, where's Gab? Oh, she had to go to class? She's allowed. And Blake Renkin, where's Blake? There's Blake back there. They were here with us today, so hats off to you and thanks for your work on all of this. Now, on with the program. So here's a question for all of us to think about. What ethical obligation, if any, do political communication professionals have, and to whom? When your job is to win, to persuade, to organize, and to mobilize, do the ends justify the means? Is any way of winning in bounds? those are the questions I think that will guide the conversation here and the project, Peter, as you're developing this. So we're going to invite the panel up in just a moment, but by way of background, last fall Peter convened several informal breakfasts with a range of people. They were off-the-record breakfasts so that people could eat as much as they wanted and speak freely without anybody tattling on them. And they could think broadly about what it meant to consider political communication ethics, what the political communication ecosystem, journalists, students, advocates, professors, and so forth, could contribute to this conversation, could add to this. The conversations were designed to help shape the project that Peter has put together, but clear that they may also be central to the project. So, though we may not answer the question directly and definitively, it's something that, like Plato, we should consider deeply. So, let me introduce the panel to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Associate Dean and Professor Jeff Brand for fearless navigation. Professor Jeff Brand, Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences here at the George Washington University, is Associate Professor of Philosophy, whose areas of expertise are political and legal ethics. And he will moderate the conversation with Samira Baird. She's a junior in SMPA, a veteran of several campaigns already, leading the rest of us to say and ask ourselves, what have we done with our lives? Crystal Benton, Managing Director of the strategic consultant firm Purple Strategies. Crystal also served as the late Senator John McCain's press secretary and the deputy communications director on his 2008 presidential campaign. Jeffrey Blount, our Shapiro Fellow and journalist in residence here this year at School of Media and Public Affairs. Jeffrey is an Emmy Award-winning director, has more than 35 years of experience working on the journalism side of politics and putting shows together. He's also the author of a forthcoming book, or is it actually out? Forthcoming book, pre-order now, The Emancipation of Evan Walls, and I highly commend that to you. And finally, Chrissie McHenry, principal at the Raben Group, where she provides strategic communication counsel to advocacy organizations. Prior to her current role, Chrissie served in the senior communication positions at Fannie Mae and NeighborWorks. She started her career as a broadcast journalist. I won't hold that against you. And Dean Brand will open the conversation. You all have cards at your tables. There will be a mic here later, and Dean Brand will welcome questions. The more provocative and thought and deep, the better. And if you want to be following and they're kind of pushing this out across social media, please do this. And you can follow the project at Twitter at Polycom Ethics. So please engage the conversation. Also, SMPA GWU is our Twitter handle. So, Jeffrey and panel, welcome to the stage. It's all yours.
Nice.
Well, I want to say thank you to Frank for the introduction. As Frank said, I'm a philosopher by training, so it's especially exciting for me to be here today with these four wonderful panelists who know a great deal about what philosophers call the real world. Although I do have to ask all of you, as a philosopher, it looks to me as though the real world is not in great shape right now. What is up with that? I think after this, I will just retreat to the ivory tower. This is a tremendously important topic, and we're grateful to have these panelists with us. I'm going to go in the order of our guests to the George Washington University first, and then turn to Jeffrey and Samira. And Crystal, I'd like to start with you.
Okay.
Now, I understand you have had quite a bit of experience working for the late Senator John McCain. I'd like to say I'm very sorry about his death, which was not that long ago. Great loss to the country. But I'd like you to think back on your time working with the senator and get us going by talking perhaps about the way Senator McCain saw the ethics of political communication. The sorts of things he would say to his staff, the modeling that he did. Any reflections that you have on that?
Sure. I think the modeling is an interesting thing to start with. I mean, it's clear whether you agreed with his political positions, that Senator McCain was a person of great character and had a long history of demonstrating that, not just speaking it, but really walking the walk. If you look at his personal story pre-politics, that's quite clear, and something that I think you could say was and is, in the form of his kids, part of his family story as well. So I do think I had a great benefit kind of starting my political career in his office, because I was able to see somebody who had rules, who had a guideline, guardrails of things we wouldn't do, and that there was clear that there was a buck that stopped, and it stopped with him. So I do think that was helpful, because when you think about the decisions you're making and whether they're ethical in the workplace, you sort of have to weigh the benefits of what you're considering doing versus the rewards that you get for doing it. And sometimes that gets really murky. But knowing that the person that you would be making those decisions on behalf of as a member of his staff, or in my case, potentially an on-the-record situation, it was always helpful to know that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the expedient thing. And I knew that was core to who he was, and so I could feel comfortable making those hard decisions with that as sort of a guardrail around any action I would take. Because there are certainly times in politics, particularly in election politics, where the quick thing, the thing that gives you the win in the moment, isn't necessarily easy to do. It's not that it's the easier thing, but it might be the more expedient thing. And so knowing that those decisions would be judged very harshly from the top was a helpful thing to have in mind and to have demonstrated through the staff, and something that he valued in his senior staff and throughout. I mean, I started my career in his office when I was 21, so to have that as my first job was really helpful, and to spend a lot of personal time with him as his press secretary, kind of going from one event to another, gave me a lot of time to talk to him about those sort of reflections as we were doing things in the office and weren't doing things in the office.
Okay, well, you mentioned you started at 21. I guess I'd like to ask you to imagine yourself, maybe it won't be that hard to imagine yourself as a young staffer coming in with a political communications career in mind, coming into Senator McCain's office. I want you to imagine a conversation where the staffer is considering doing something, and the senator maybe pushes back and says, yes, that might be expedient, but it's not right. And now I want you to imagine the staffer saying, well, but it's not illegal, Senator. It's not illegal. Why do we have boundaries that go beyond what criminal and civil law require of us, federal election law? Why do we need those boundaries?
Well, it's interesting, because I don't know if I'm going to shift your lens a little bit, but in my current role, I advise major Fortune 500 companies on how to deal with reputation risk. And it's different than the political environment, because they're not talking about, there are Wednesdays in corporate reputation, the story doesn't end on election day. And so things that you might do in a campaign environment, you wouldn't do when you're managing a brand's reputation, because they have been around for 100 years, want to be around for 100 years, tens of thousands of people depend on that, communities built around. So the notion of what you can do versus what you should do, I think is more distinct in my current world, because there are ramifications beyond that moment, right? But in politics, I think that question is salient, if not more so, but certainly harder to answer. I can think of instances. There was a time in the 2008 campaign where we were, it was in the general running against President Obama, and there was a lot of, I think it was in March, I can't remember what was happening outside of that, but there was an opportunity. Press was covering then Senator Obama's his Reverend Wright story. There was a lot of tension in the campaign about what we were going to do with that story. It created an opportunity to certainly win the singular news cycle, but arguably that story was kind of going for a week or so, and in presidential campaigns, a win in a day matters, a win in a week is huge. And Senator McCain drew a hard line that we weren't going to use that as we were not going to play into that hand. There were certainly people doing it, but our campaign wasn't going to participate in that storyline because he saw it as an attack on Senator Obama's character. And that wasn't what we were trying to do. We weren't trying to, question his motives, but maybe question the judgment at which he and his team were trying to accomplish certain things. We disagreed with the route to the end, but didn't necessarily disagree on the end goal of, it sounds really romantic, but making the country a better place. So to attack character takes you off of that, I think. And I remember distinctly that there were folks who are, political animals who just wanted that win. And it was hard to let it go. And there was a lot of tension around that and some really clear penalties we would pay if we tried to tease that story out in a more subtle way. So I hope that answers your question about.
It does. It does. I'd like to follow up and ask if the problem is attacking character, or if the problem in this case was attacking the character of someone whose character Senator McCain actually thought was perfectly fine. Was that the issue? I mean, what if you're running against someone whose character you really don't respect?
Well,
is going to character off limits in that case?
I think you have to have a really high bar for that. And if you're going to ask me to reflect on my time with McCain to answer that question, I would refer you to how he dealt with the current president and his disagreements around what you might characterize as character disagreements with President Trump, but how he managed that and focused it on bigger things than personal attacks.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Chrissie now, and I do want to encourage the panel to jump in, and we will get to the audience in due course. So, Chrissie, you're currently consulting. You are in political communication at this point. Your clients are advocacy groups, correct? Yes. So, I'd like you to think about or share with us your reflections on where the bright lines are, if there are any. And if there are no bright lines, where are the fuzzy lines in terms of the difference between acceptable and unacceptable tactics? That's a big question. I can make it narrower if you want, but
no, it is a big question, and I don't know that there's any one, sort of one answer. I think that when I think about advising clients on where to go and how to move forward, it is, one, thinking about who the audiences are that they're trying to reach, how they're going to do that, how they're building sort of ambassadors and others who will carry forth with that. But it has to be, and as you're doing that, as you're thinking about who's going to come on board, who will you appeal to and how, you're thinking about, it's sort of like the Wednesdays, right? It's like thinking about how do you bring people on who you want to engage instead of turning them off. And so, so the attempt is to be aggressive and to be forceful and to, there are some, perhaps there are some truths in terms of what people's beliefs are and what they wish for the country, but it gets down to, how would you achieve that? And I have to say, I've not come across anything that I felt like that we were getting close to any lines, so that's not a space, I feel like a lot of the work that we do is really sort of pushing people to engage in conversations, to sort of think about where they are and where we are and where we want to go, and sort of how to do that, and how do you, yes, you apply some kinds of pressure and that kind of thing, but it is not it's high stakes political work, and it's really important social and cultural work and business work, but I think that we managed to do that without teetering on the edge of what's appropriate, and getting beyond sort of some common humane ways of engaging and talking with people. Okay, so you never feel tempted to use tactics that raise any kinds of ethical questions in your mind? I'll say that I haven't been, which is not because I'm so saintly, but more that I think that the work that I've been called upon to do and the clients that I've been working with, I could see a path that, that resonated with me, with the folks that I work with, and the path forward that we saw. So it hasn't felt like a lot of questioning in that way. More, I think, as an observer of, sort of both the political climate that we find ourselves in, and, in my past life as a journalist, thinking about sort of how different the discourse has become and how different some of the tactics have become. That's more where I find myself sort of looking and sort of judging that against where I want to be in my own life and work and path forward.
Okay, well that leads to what I was going to ask you about next, is if you see tactics on let's call it the other side, that you feel as though they should be called out. Maybe for strategic reasons you don't call them out, but as we think about what a political communication ethics should be, what the sort of shared standards should be, do you wake up in the morning and read your feed, read what the folks on the other side are saying, and ever say, that's over the line, and there should be some sort of collective response available, whether it's a professional code of ethics or a calling out of some kind or a shunning? There's lots of different techniques, but if you could maybe talk about that. It's clear you can get where you want to go without hitting any ethical third rails, but your opponents presumably can't.
Well, and I'm not sure I can get where I want to go without hitting them. I mean, so it's not that this is necessarily the successful way, but I just have not, I have not found myself sort of pushed in that far direction. But I think, yes, when you wake up and you find that you see something that you're uncomfortable with, then the question is, how do you either, sort of double down on your own behavior to sort of reinforce what maybe, you think is a more appropriate path forward. And then, the calling out is a tough call because it's a question of judgment in terms of whether, whether you're adding to or subtracting from the conversation. And some things are not worthy of response, so there is that, sort of level of not wanting to get into like a sort of a dogfight on a topic. You don't want to bring more attention to something than it's already gotten. So from time to time, the response is not to do much more or to bring more attention to it. Other times, sometimes the example that you set and the way that you respond is in and of itself a response and a calling out of either bad behavior or tactics that are, sort of below the board. And then finally, there are times, and I'm trying to, that you want to say something, sort of very specifically about that. But I think for the most part, I have found with a lot of my work is that it is more that you don't want to call attention to it than that you want to, sort of spend a lot of time on it. And it's not today's current political environment, but more some of these smaller areas.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to Jeffrey now and sort of make a transition. Chris, you were a broadcast journalist. You have been a broadcast journalist for your entire career. Yeah. And we can't get away from journalism in this conversation, even though political communications is one thing and journalism is another. There's a revolving door. People go from the one to the other.
Yes.
And I wonder if you have thoughts about what that transition's like. I'm sure you've mentored people who have crossed over and gone from journalism and its internal ethics over to political communication. If such a person comes to you and says, hey, I've got this great opportunity in political communications, but I don't want to lose the ethical core that I have as a journalist. I recognize my job's changing. How can I carry some of what I've learned as a journalist into this new role? Are they out of luck, or is there some word of wisdom you can give?
I think it's a tough transition because I think it's fairly clear in the journalism world. If you're, you have sort of four basic tenets of, we will tell the facts, we will try not to do harm, whether or not the story being reported, you balance that, the knowledge for the people as opposed to the harm it could do. You stay away from any kind of conflict of interest, and that kind of stuff. And you're clear about when you make a mistake and you come forward and you make that clear. So, but I don't, and it's very, and you live by those rules, and it's very easy to live by that you need to be, your world needs to be controlled by facts. And when you move to political communication or you move to PR, and like you were saying, you have another goal in mind, it's hard to stay with those clear rules. So it becomes a personal thing. What are you willing to do in order to gain what you're trying to do? And you have to have your own personal rules about what you're going to do there. I mean, I don't think necessarily the journalism world translates, what controls us translates into what controls people who are in the political arena. Those are the things we want to report about, or people who can't maintain that. So I don't, it's a very difficult thing. I mean, I would just say if I'm talking to someone about it, you need to sit down and have some conversation with yourself about how far you would go and then setting the symbol, as Chrissie was saying, setting the line about by your actions about where you would go. I did tell. I'll tell you a story that I told one student who was going into PR and was talking about the difference between this and asking about your moral, where the line is drawn. And I told a story about my daughter when I was working at NBC, and I promised my daughter that I would be at a school event. And it wasn't earth-shattering, but I promised I'd be there. Something happened at work, and they told me, you have to be here tomorrow to do the show. And I thought about it, and I said, no, I'm going to go to my daughter's thing. So they sent down the deputy bureau chief and called me out of the control room and took me in the hall and said, if you don't come tomorrow, this is going to be really bad for you. And I said to him, well, let me look at it this way. At some point, you'll probably let me go. I don't think she's going to let me go. So I have to make a decision here about where I stand. And so I'm going to go with her. I'm going to go, and you do what you have to do. So in the end, they didn't do anything. But the Saturday, I taped a Chris Matthews show on the Friday. On the Saturday, something else happened. And they said, we have to redo the show. So the executive producer called me at home and said, can you come in, or are you with your family? And so I said, just by talking to this one person, I set a line. I drew a line in the sand. And so I think when my suggestion would be, when you're faced with that, the first time you're faced with that, when you go into that, is to draw the line in the sand and let people know where you stand, where you won't go.
I have an adult daughter, and I have to tell you, I think I'm still on probation, so I'm glad that worked out for you.
Yeah.
But I think they can let you go.
Yeah.
They can stop taking your phone calls. But I'm glad that that worked out. So, do you think there are lessons to be learned from journalistic ethics that someone could take with them? Right. I understand
Truth.
about setting
Truth.
truth. So truth. Honesty.
Truth.
Does honesty mean the same thing when you are working for a principal?
Yes, it should.
It should?
The problem today, the problem today is when we can't agree on what truth is and what a fact is. But it should. If you're a truthful person, that should be a part of who you are and is seen by your colleagues, no matter what job you're working in and what arena you're in. He or she is an honest person, and we can trust in that when we talk to that person, or when we're going to that person for advice, or when we're trying to, as a client, if I'm looking at them and asking for direction, I can trust them because my whole relationship with them has been one of honesty, and I've been led down a factual road each time. So I can bank on that. So that's the most important thing I say you take with you.
So one component of honesty in the case of journalism is the journalist's obligation to correct the record, to
Yes.
correct misrepresentations.
That's correct.
Is this something that you would see as carrying over to political communications?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So if I'm in political communications, I say to you, yeah, sometimes we get things wrong. Sometimes we even maybe know at the time we're getting things wrong. We're putting things out there that are demonstrably false. We don't have to correct the record because that's what you folks are going to do. Journalists are going to do that. We don't have to affirmatively correct the record or take responsibility for the misstatement. Let's just let the free marketplace of ideas sort it out, right? We have a principal to represent here, principal AL, right? We have a boss. What do you say to them? They're wrong.
What kind of political discourse do you want? I mean, that's the question I ask. I mean, if you want to go back to McCain, so it's out there that President Obama is not really an American, or Senator Obama is not really an American. He's a Muslim. And this is out there. It's throughout the political discourse. That's what people are saying and arguing over and that sort of thing. And so when this woman gets up and says that, what does McCain say? Takes the mic. No, ma'am, that's not the truth. That's not the case. Yeah. So, and that could obviously not play well for him within the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. But you set a standard because you want to be truthful. And if we're no longer truthful, and I think today's White House is an example of that, if we're no longer truthful, if all of these things are just flying in the wind and something's right and something's not wrong, then we don't have a basis for truth. We don't have a basis for fact. And then we all are lost. We all get lost in that.
Mm-hmm. My recollection of the exchange with the woman, the famous exchange that
right.
Senator McCain was that she said, he's not an American.
That's
she
right.
said of Obama, he's not an American, he's an Arab. And is this correct? And then Senator McCain said, no, ma'am, he's an American.
That's right.
Right. Right. So just in the interest of
A factual.
exactly.
Right, I agree.
Correcting the record. All
He
right.
said something about he said something like, he's a good man.
He's a good. Yeah.
That was always what caught me as an interesting.
Yeah. He
He's a
seemed,
good man.
Yeah. He seemed to
Which is-
be reading an awful lot into what she'd said correctly, I think, and then rebutting not exactly what she said, but what she seemed to be thinking. Yes. Well, Samira, you are the future. You already have a lot of political
No
communication
pressure.
experience for someone your age, and you're clearly interested enough in the ethical dimensions of the profession that you've embarked upon to be sitting here on this panel. So I want to ask you, sort of, what keeps you up at night in terms of what's down the road for you? What are maybe you'll be lucky like Chrissie and you'll work for a principal where you're not asked to do things that challenge your moral compass.
Yeah.
But you can't always choose who you're working for or what the news cycle looks like, and so I'm wondering, are there scenarios you could imagine yourself in where you would have to make a really tough choice between resigning, blowing a whistle, just sucking it up, so to speak, and doing what your principal tells you need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I take it very seriously that you have to be able to sleep at night, and we're here to I know one of the questions is who are we in service to? I think you're in service to the people who elected your principal.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that keeps me up at night is the internet, because wherever I'm doing things to light the internet on fire and doing digital ads and all the gamut of things that you experience when you interact with a candidate on the internet. And that raises a lot of questions for any party about how you're interacting with the internet, how you're using the internet, how you're taking advantage of the situation in which the internet lacks transparency, and digital ads, though there have been efforts to be made transparent, still lack transparency. You can launch a whole narrative about a candidate on a digital ad campaign with very little scrutiny. And so it raises a lot of ethical questions about where do you draw your line when you do that work, and when there might not be accountability, when there might not be someone, getting a CNN segment about a real TV ad you ran. There's no one knows what you're doing on the internet for the most part, and so that's what I think about a lot. And I think one of the reasons we all appreciate Professor Blount as students is that he asks the questions that a 20-year-old would ask in the room. And that's what I try to do. That's an ethical standard I hold myself to when I'm in offices, is ask the questions like, hey, why are you why are you targeting that demographic? How did you make the decision to target that slim a demographic? Like, all these things that feel a little shady, that the internet feels a little shady. And I think we should all talk about that and really grapple with it. So yeah, I guess what I stay up at night thinking about is making sure that I'm asking the questions that a naive 20-year-old should be asking, which is, what are we doing with these tools? And if this is the future, how are we making sure that we're not short-sighted about it in favor of one candidate or one cause? So that's what I'm really focused on.
I think that's a great point, because if we are in the darkness and we're operating, what moderates us? So do we have a shared value system in this country, or through all the many different sections of the country, or this church or that church, or this belief or that belief? Who moderates that? Is there a general moderation? So you might ask me a question of, if can I get away with saying this? Well, in certain world, that's okay. Over here, it's not okay. So what is the overall moderation that keeps us from being something less than a true communicator?
But if we thought that we had that shared value system, even as different as we may have been, and have we lost it, or did we not ever have it? And that today is just showing the, sort of the chasm between us. And that's one of the things that I think a lot about, is that, are we heading down a path, or were we always there and didn't really quite realize it? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is what I think about is, sort of who do we want to be, and how do we achieve that, even as different as we both may approach different issues. And so I feel like I date myself in that I don't necessarily want to agree with the candidates that I support 100%. Mm-hmm. What I want to know is that they share some fundamental sort of founding truths about who we are as people and who we want to be. And so if we disagree on the path, every piece of the path, I could live with that. But I feel like we're getting to the point where we're not, sort of following sort of that McCain tradition, but we are instead, it's all or nothing. It's a litmus test over what you think, how you would achieve what you want to achieve, what you're willing to do to achieve that, who you're willing to either step on or step around, what truths you are willing to, or untruths you are willing to champion. And it's unclear where to go from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think sort of bringing together three different threads about thinking about advocacy and moving people along sort of their decision set to the place you want them to be to accomplish the goal that you have. The notion of which truth is truth versus is it all true, or you're in the universe of truth and you select the truths that you share. Yeah. You're not lying, you're not disregarding the truth, but you're selecting the truth. Because I would challenge that PR doesn't ask you to reject the truth. It encourages you to find the truths that most best fit your story for your audience. And then you think about the different tools that folks are using now and how that narrows, particularly in politics with the information that you're getting, the stakeholders that are paying attention. It's very easy to speak exclusively to your base now. And it's very easy to use different tools to tell one part of the story to a set of audiences on those tools to have a conversation here that gins up the energy and moves either voting or action or just conversation in favor of that point of view. And so it does start to, I think, impact and narrow the lens and the playing field of what people have a duty to. I mean, when I was working on the Hill, the big thing that was in 2004, and the thing that was different then was that for me, being in McCain's office, we didn't necessarily, I don't know if I should say this, but we didn't necessarily hold duty to the party at the front. Mm-hmm. And a lot of offices did that. What are we talking about? What are we focused on this week was about what's the party's message? What is Republican conference bringing forward? What do we need to do? And we weren't at that time deeply burdened by that.
You're a bit of a maverick? Is that what you said?
But so the notion of what was your duty to, if you asked somebody in our office, our duty was in a very romantic sense to elevating democracy and all of those things at the highest level. There are other offices where I think people would have put duty to party first. And so that was a different question, because even at duty to party, you had a lot of audiences. You had to talk to them in newspapers and on TV, which meant you had more audiences than just these slivers of people that you could get excited about one particular fact or particular point of view that really can shift the dialogue in a pretty dramatic way. I mean, there's all these structural implications that aren't inherently ethical in their consideration set, but around redistricting and the media platforms that we engage on, that really does shift, to your point, the rules, or it feels like it hasn't. I don't think it shouldn't shift the rules, but the way you engage when you're just driving at the base of your party in a primary election, for instance, because nobody turns out in the primaries, right? So go vote. Yes. But if you want to expand the conversation, we need to see more people than the base show up in those elections.
I would like to say to the audience, we're going to be taking questions very shortly. I'm going to pose one more question to the panel, and then we'll take questions from our audience. So the question, this is really for everybody here, is again one of these hypotheticals. Where imagine a young, committed a young person in entering political communication with a cause. Their loyalty is not to a party, it's to a cause. Let's say it could be climate change, it could be gun control, it could be abortion, it could be anything across the political spectrum. They're committed to it in 2019. And they come to you and they say, look, I don't see that anything is more important than getting to this end. And you're now telling me that there are ethical absolutes about what I can and can't say. what I can and can't put out there. And yet I see, especially on the internet, nobody else seems to be playing by those rules. So why should I put our cause, which is the most important thing on this planet, at a competitive disadvantage with people who aren't playing by the rules? So I can sleep at night? I'm not going to sleep at night if we lose. What do you say to them?
You know, it feels like, you know, we've created this sort of all or nothing sort of mentality, win or lose. You know, sort of having to have all things. We've lost, you know, sort of that sense of whether it's negotiation, building partnerships, building relationships. You know, sort of that notion that maybe, you know, a good outcome is that everyone is a little unhappy. Maybe not a lot, but you know, and so like looking for that. And I think it gets to the bigger question. I mean, if you can only look at the one thing that you're looking at, maybe you even sell that one thing short because you're not able to grow it and develop it to a place where it has more supporters, a bigger place in our conversations. You know, sort of, it takes a seat at the table. If it's only one thing, it's sort of bound to be on the fringe, even if you have others who think it's the most important thing also. I don't know. It just feels like I feel like I'm the great voice of moderation, but it feels like the more we can do to bring people into the one thing that we love and understand the one thing that they love, the further we may be able to get.
Yeah. I agree with that. I'm not sure that I'd make an argument to that person based on ethical practices, but rather on the reality of accomplishing your goal. I think about the movement for marriage equality. There was a distinct decision among the campaign organizers in that effort when it came to talking to Republicans to find the messages that worked for their audience and lean in there. And it created a lot of upset among some of their base of organizers of like, well, aren't we leaving out this group? And why is this message the one we're leading with? Because that's not the one that matters most to us. And it was very upsetting, I think, from the field organizers who've been working on this issue for a really long time to have data tell them, if you want to win this, you have to just leave that alone for a minute. And you've got to focus on the goal. And the goal is to move this person and this person. And these people need to hear this, to believe in our cause. And if we want to just run in and beat our chest and say the same thing that hasn't worked for years, then we can do that all day long. But if we want to win this and come out better on the other end, then we have to focus our message to hit the audience that we want to move. And so I would be more inclined to talk about efficacy over ethics in that sort of scenario with somebody who just couldn't get out of their way around perfection being the enemy of the good.
Yeah, very nice. All right, I think we should turn it over to the audience. People have questions here. I think that's a great example, Crystal, where members of the LGBTQ community, right? We're not all on board with marriage as a concept, and yet that faction made sort of a pact, as it were, and said we're not going to push polyamory or what have you right now because it's going to turn off the people we need to convince, and we see the result today. So, do you have a question from the audience? Oh, sir.
So as professional communicators, oftentimes you are presented with information about opposing candidates that's objectively bad information. Information that gives you no ethical dilemma with regard to whether or not you're going to use that information. So I want you to think about this from the perspective of time. Oftentimes you get that information, and if I'm a senator who's running for office and I have a habit of standing outside the cafeteria and forcing all the other senators to give me their lunch money before they go in, that's objectively bad behavior, and you can use that. But what about when that objectively bad behavior is behavior that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And you're the person who has to make a decision now as to whether or not you're going to use objectively bad behavior that isn't happening currently, or that didn't just recently happen, but happened a long time ago. We're seeing this a lot in our politics, and it creates a big dilemma for political communicators. So does time make a difference with regard to objectively bad behavior?
Great question. To the panel.
Well, I think in the journalism world, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about one of the tenets being that you want to try to minimize harm. So the question would be, how worthy is this in terms of the dynamics of what's happening now? Does it inform the public? Is the public's need to know great enough that we have to go back and bring that forward? That's the question in the journalism world. I have been in many situations where people have said no, and where stories have not been brought to air because they have made that decision. So I think there are people who do make those decisions based on the ethics and those kinds of things. I just think it's about the impact. If you were running for office today and you did something that was extraordinarily horrendous, I think most journalists would want to bring that forward and have to talk about that. And if you changed your way or whatever, then give you that opportunity to say that. But it's a question, I think, and that's an editorial room question. I don't think that's a one-person question. I think that's a conversation that people have to have and decide whether or not that reporter or that producer who's bringing the issue forward is making a contribution or bringing forth a negative that's not going to do anything except cause harm.
The other piece, it feels like, I feel like I'm looking for two things: either a pattern of behavior, so something that sort of confirms or affirms something that you think you've known, or something that is so completely contrary to someone's brand or presence or something like that. So if you spend your whole life talking about people, judging people for being unfaithful to their wives or husbands, and then it turns out you have done the same thing. Those are the sort of, as a journalist in particular, but also, sort of as, just looking at the communication space, that's the place where you go, something's not right here. And it makes you, sort of want to dig deeper and to know more. It doesn't necessarily answer the question. I think what's so hard, even looking at Virginia over this last few weeks, yes. What's been so hard is, the obvious pieces, but is it possible to rehabilitate yourself? If you look at a state from the Democrats' point of view that is trying to or becoming either purple or blue, that is a southern state where, maybe people of a certain age, I'm not saying necessarily the governor, but maybe people of a certain age had different viewpoints, had come up in different communities at a different time. Can you be different than you were? And if you are, should you, necessarily be dragged through all of this pain? And yet, of course, the flip side is, sort of how difficult and painful, sort of the racial history is in this country. So I don't, it's hard to know the answer, but it is that question of, if you create a litmus test that a whole swath of the country of a certain age might not be able to meet from a period in the past, how have you confined the political conversation and the work and the progress that we hope to make together?
I was just going to bring up Virginia too, because I spent some time on the Northam campaign and have been really thinking about this. And I think it's a generational shift too. I have no patience for it. I absolutely none. There's more space in politics, I think, in the view of people my age. Get in Jennifer Carroll Foy, who you can do a lot with this. And so I think it's this stuff is representative of core things in a person's existence. Mm-hmm. And one of the ethical things it's an ethical question for me too, because I think with that reduction of patience, there's less patience with kids my age, there's a all or nothing feel. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's easy to make the ethical call, Northam, get out, but there are more questions. It's not black and white, it's not all or nothing in reality. So yeah, but I do think there's less patience for that stuff, and it also cuts down on the ability to say, oh, we can be moderate, we can work this out in a easy fashion.
I think I think both of you are talking about, I think it's a perfect example of Northam in that, I definitely had this conversation about why, this was brought forth and the media attention to this, and having grown up in Virginia and had a lot of conversation with folks from there about, can we change? Do we get a second chance? Why is it important to bring this out about him? Well, because if he has changed, then we need to give him that opportunity. But this is a story in the editorial room, where we say we will do this story. Why will we do this story? Because 20% of the people in this state are black. And not to count the people who are not black, who are or some other race, who also feel that there's a problem with this. So can you now govern effectively for 20% or more of your state? There's a real reason for bringing that issue forward, because the mindset behind the ability to do something like that says you don't take my pain seriously, and therefore I need you to now tell me how you have grown and show you that. Now, he must have done it a little bit, because there are at least one poll that says that African Americans have said, let's give him a second chance, because he's brought in Medicaid, he's done some other things, so let's see what he can do. But so the story itself, I think, was definitely worthy of being brought forward and worthy of being discussed, because he has a constituency that he has to be able to work for, and they have to trust in him.
From the audience.
Really interesting discussion. So I was flicking the channels last night, and I flicked onto Turner Classic Movies, and I watched one of the first talkies. It was made in 1930. And what was interesting about it was you could tell they really didn't understand how to make, like, what a movie should be, where there's actual sound, and there was no plot to it whatsoever. It was just people singing and that sort of thing. And in some ways, I feel that that's the way we are with modern media, with the internet, in that, let's just take the case with Northam, or, look, this wasn't mainstream media that found this. This was a person who found this photograph, just like I could go back into my old 1978 high school yearbook, the Enchiridion at Lower Merion High School, and take a photo of what somebody had done. And I'm a media platform. I have my 4,000 followers on Twitter, and if there was somebody who was running for office and I put it up there and there was something really bad or embarrassing, that would eventually get onto the major news stations. And what I'm wondering is, as we're looking about ethics in political communication, what is kind of the ethics of the viewer, of the consumer of this as well? Is it that what we really need to do is in some ways have the consumer be better at this, the way the consumer became better at movies and said, like, no, these early movies, they're not good enough, it needs something more. Where is the responsibility of the viewer of this as well as the media outlets?
How do we get our mind around the idea of the viewer, the citizen, the voter having a responsibility to check the political communication profession? Is that a notion that makes sense?
Well, I mean, it goes to the question of, a lot of these stories, you're right about the genesis of that. Standing Rock started exploding because of online Twitter and stuff like that. I guess the question is, from a journalism standpoint, there are no rules as far as the general public about what people decide to post and not post. And then I think that goes back to what Samira was talking about, where you're in the internet's in this big open space, and people just get on and say whatever, and without any rules. I don't know how we corral that.
It's interesting to me. One is that the curiosity that we all have. And so, can we be both curious and take a proper role, if there is one, and sort of driving towards some shared sense of what should or shouldn't be there, or how it should be regulated. I read this week someone talking about having a PBS for the internet, so sort of having a source of content that was, I don't know, above, more lofty than others, or truer, or maybe just sort of publicly funded. It could be any number or all of those things. But it is a tough one. I am always tempted by, I think it's clickbait, and my children are always saying, stop clicking on all that stuff. So, but you find yourself curious. Mm-hmm. What I wonder about Virginia is whether, because I can't quite remember what's on my yearbook page, is this something that was over him that he wondered about? And so this gets back to like strategy. Was it something that he worried it would be discovered, in which case I think he should have brought it out himself? Or had he just totally forgotten he ever did this, and he was like, must be fine with it, and then all of a sudden, sort of it's come into the fore.
We have time for one more question.
So kind of keeping on the subject of like this zero tolerance policy in the Democratic Party when it comes to actions that President Trump himself has committed, or similar actions when it comes to sexual misconduct or racism. I guess my question here is, one, in a situation where it happens that somebody says something morally repugnant or does something morally repugnant, but you don't think it has an effect on the policies that they are going to put forward and impact. In that kind of situation where a Republican or somebody who completely disagrees with your values in a certain place would end up taking office, do you think that there is a kind of fine line at a certain point where we shouldn't be having people leave office just for the purpose of the politics of it and because it makes us feel good? And second, when it came to the resignation of Senator Franken, who I actually went to Professor Loge's class right after that, and there was a great class discussion on it. But his colleagues, when he was resigning, they were hugging him and saying, "We're going to miss you. We're going to miss you." And Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia said it was one of the most hypocritical things he's ever seen. And that situation, it made sense politically because we knew, as I'm saying this as a Democrat, we knew that we would elect a Democrat in his seat, and we knew it would help us in Alabama. My question is, when that's not the case, and it's going to lead to a policy that, as a Democrat, we think would hurt people, are we willing to do that same thing? Are we willing to make that same decision, or is it all political? Because I'm a Democrat and I'm not even sure anymore.
I don't know if I can answer a question that says we, because I'm not a Democrat. Although I'm not really sure I can say I'm a Republican right now either, just to be clear. Yeah, but it's interesting. So we were talking over lunch about the money in the mug of Michael Brown, and I think that more often than not, most ethical decisions in work or in politics aren't the big scary, like, do you take the money or not? I mean, the answer to that is you don't take the money. But most of the questions are more, do I value the individual or do I value the group? Do I value some sense of loyalty, whether it's party or principle, or do I value truth? And so I think that you've raised an interesting question around how you might prioritize whether or not it makes sense. I mean, I think that's a really interesting example, watching what happened with Franken from my perspective, not being invested in the outcome of his seat or necessarily in the Alabama seat, was a good example of politics being a very ugly game sometimes, where there was a win that came for some people that came at great cost to others, and I don't feel like people were asking themselves the question of what that meant for democracy or for the country, but rather were trying to win, trying to pick their side of that line, that's a hard line, on this one topic at that time. And so I don't know that I have a good answer for you if the Democratic Party and the Democrats involved in that did the right thing, but the Democrats were also the same people who sort of pushed him out. So it wasn't like Republicans were calling for his ouster. But knowing that you'd have a Democrat in the other seat, I guess the big picture is great. We still have control of that seat, so nothing lost here, except arguably things were lost there. I guess that collectively the party made a decision in some form, or at least individuals tracked toward the same decision about what was a priority in that instance. And I don't know which thing of those things they were putting first. I think might have been really selfish, frankly, to think like, well, I just have to take a stand on this topic right now, and there's a person that I'm friends with who's part of my party who supports policies I support. And I'm going to draw the line on that side and give myself a win, regardless of cost to him.
And it's not a problem to show that person that you assume that when they were saying goodbye to him, there's some measure of caring about who that person is, despite what they've done. You know, you cross that line and you need to step aside, but I still respect you as a person. I still respect, an example for me would be when Brian Williams was taken off NBC Nightly News. I was proud of the fact that the Washington bureau that I was in led the charge in saying, wait a minute, this is not acceptable and it can't be, we can't continue to live with this. So Brian was taken off the show. When Brian came to Washington to say, I'm sorry, and he did, and people lined up in the hall to hug him because they had a history with him, even though they knew he had crossed the line, and so he had to go. So I think that's a bit of what you were talking about, a bit of showing the value structure that we look for, that even though you are one of us, there is a line that all of us we can't cross, and we will let you go. We'll tell you how much we are thankful and we appreciate you, but you did cross that line, and you know, and I know that you need to go. So I think, you know, that answers a lot of questions I think that you had raised earlier.
Yeah, though sometimes I think that line is a function of politics.
Oh, absolutely.
And that, you know, that in a different day, in a different year, a different person, a different place or party, gender, and the whole list, the outcome would be quite different. And
well,
so it's,
how often do we hear today, you know, what's said in the White House today would have never been said 20 years ago, or, you know, no matter whether the president was Democrat or Republican. So it's a change, it's a movable feast, so to speak, I guess.
And there's the ethical implications of, like, we'll just say her name. What was Gillibrand's ethical responsibility in pushing that to the center of the debate?
Right.
Like, that's a function of politics. Is that ethically okay?
Yeah.
Is that, I think a lot of women would agree that it's good that that's at the center of the debate, but at what cost? You know, I happen to think it was the right thing to do, but it was a function of politics, and that's really interesting. To what ends will we go to center something at a debate or make sure people are talking about something?
I think on that note, we should thank our panel and turn things back over to Frank Sesno.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel very much. I'd like to thank Peter Loge for getting us launched here. Some words I heard today: truth, honesty, trust, correcting the record. And they raise more questions, unfortunately, I suppose, like a good conversation about ethics is supposed to do. According to whom? Enforced by whom? Defined by whom? Can you be ethical if your opponents are not? What role will the public play in all of this? How does social media and this strange world called the internet drive or distort this process? So clearly this is a conversation that needs to be continued, and it will be under the leadership of Peter Loge. So you can follow the project on Twitter at Polycom Ethics. You can also learn more at politicalcommunicationethics.org. We'd love for you to weigh in with your thoughts on how we can steer this conversation and how we can press the philosopher here into service to help us navigate through this ethical quagmire. Thank you all very much for joining us here today. Thanks very much for playing Sisyphus with us and getting this rock rolling uphill. If we keep it rolling, we might actually get someplace. So, Peter, thanks to you, and have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining us.